and they have enough food that can last them a year or two. If you're outside the city, you have to protect yourself. You have to build not only they have tents, but you have to build temporary fortifications in case the people from the city come out and attack you. The sanitary conditions in one of these camps is not going to be very good. If the situation inside the city is bad, it may be worse outside on the camp that is laying siege to the city. So you may find yourself um, in a situation where half of your army is ill, or even worse, half of your army is dead because of cholera or an illness like that. So the Assyrians could not afford to just wait until the enemy was ready to surrender. So they developed these machines, these siege engines that enabled them to destroy fortifications. And here in this image, you see one of the most important ones, which is called a battering ram. A battering ram is basically a wooden structure with wheels, and you can see the wheels at the bottom. It has a wooden mechanism uh, that allows a long trunk with a metal tip to swing. And as it swings, it hits the walls, and hopefully the walls will collapse. There are men inside who bring it close to the walls, and there are men inside swinging the trunk, the actual ram, swinging the ram against the walls. Now you see these rectangular panels, those are goat skins, goat hides that have been soaked in water for a long time. So before the battle, they are placed around the structure of the battering ram, and they are nailed and or tied with ropes. And what happens is that as the battering ram approaches the wall, the people from the top will be shooting fire arrows. But because the skins are wet, the battering ram will not catch fire. So as you can see, these Assyrians think of everything. And when they come to these situations, when they come and lay siege to a city, they have a whole element in the army of sappers. The sappers, remember, are these people who are very important because they build bridges, they build fortifications, and they are the ones who are building these siege engines that are so essential for their success. Here we see another weapon that is used, the siege tower. And the siege tower is a tower with wheels that you push close to the wall. There are people on top shooting down arrows, but below them there is a platform that basically is a plank that drops and allows soldiers to go up the structure and jump on the wall of the enemy city. And if you look at this illustration on the right to below, there's also a little platform there, which is basically a shield platform where archers are standing, or they're kneeling down, shooting arrows at the enemy. Imagine not one battering ram, but 20. Imagine not one siege tower, but 20 siege towers. And imagine dozens and dozens of ladders, good old ladders, they still do the job, right? At the same time, all attacking from different angles and getting inside the city. There's something else that they did, and this is called undermining. I'm sure that you have seen images of mines, especially old mines. You dig a tunnel, but as you dig, you have to reinforce that tunnel with beams and with pieces of wood so that the roof does not collapse on you. So what the Assyrians would do is that they would dig a tunnel under the city, exactly under either a wall or a tower, a point that they thought it was structurally weak, and then they would set fire to the wood holding the ceiling up. Of course, this is very difficult because if you set up fire in the tunnel, fire needs oxygen. So you need a bellow to pump oxygen into the tunnel so the combustible matter burns. And very often they would use bitumen. Bitumen is this is stuff that they find in the Middle East, which is it's basically petroleum. It looks like the stuff that people put, the tar that they put on roofs, but sometimes it's like thick, almost like a rock. So they would fill the this mine shaft under the walls with this, and they would let it burn. So what happens when things start burning? The wood with the beams and the columns holding the ceiling, they also burn. And the moment they burn, this collapses. So it creates the effect of a sinkhole. And with the collapse of the ceiling of this mine, the wall collapses. So as you can see, they think of everything, and it works. Once they take a town, all hell breaks loose. In the walls of Assyrian palaces, you find depictions of the brutal way in which the Assyrians dealt with their enemies. Men would be flayed alive. Flaying is when you're basically, your skin is taken out with a knife. Impalement, which is basically when they put a stake through you and they stick that stake on the floor so that you are stuck to the stake and basically sliding down slowly. Decapitations, a lot of them, and the reason for that was also practical. They would pile the heads and they would count them because soldiers and officers would be rewarded according to that. And of course, the Assyrian kings loved to illustrate these things in the palaces, and they were inscriptions. I, Sennacherib, or I, Ashurbanipal, went to the land of whatever people, and I killed 20,000 of them. Or there are 20,000 widows crying now because I killed their husbands. Very theatrical, very dramatic language, but also very real and very brutal. And you can imagine that in those days, the price of war is also women, and women were systematically raped, and you can just imagine the horrible things that happened when these cities were taken. And there's another element to it. Soldiers who have been living under horrible conditions for 3 months, the moment they go in, usually they are allowed to do whatever they want because it's a huge release. The last thing that you want is a mutiny by the soldiers. So the soldiers know that if the city falls, they can just do whatever they want. But there's another reason, and this one is a political reason. The Assyrians understand that if they're going to conquer a country, they may have to take several cities. Can the Assyrians, even with 100, even with 200,000 men in their armies, can they afford to lay siege to every single city that they want to conquer? That is, can they afford to utilize 40,000 men, 50,000 men at a time, wait for 3, 4, 6 months, perhaps a year, because we know that some sieges lasted 1 or 2 years, wait for this so that the city can fall, expose your troops to a plague, which is what apparently happened when they tried to conquer Jerusalem. They were about to be successful, but eventually a plague hit the camp, so they decided to leave. No. So the Assyrian kings know that if they take a city, they have to act in the most brutal way that you can imagine. Why? Because by doing this, they will scare the others. You see, a lot of people are willing to fight and die for their country or their city or their king. Not too many people are willing to die impaled for their king or be flayed, that is, skin alive for their king. To have their women raped and their children and animals and killed, and I mean, everything. The Assyrians would go into a town and they would destroy everything that lived. And they would make sure that people knew. How do we know about these things? Well, in part because their enemies wrote about them, but also because they wrote about them. And right here in these 2 illustrations, you see on the left how when they conquer Elam, they are destroying an Elamite city that resisted. So after the city falls, they level the city. And that is a lesson for the other cities. Don't resist, because this is how you will end up. And it is also very effective. Now, what you see on the right is something called mass deportations. the Assyrians, once they had conquered a country, would divide the local population of that conquered country, and they would deport them to different parts of the empire. This would serve several purposes. By dividing them, well, they're weaker. Then by forcing them on these long marches, you get rid of a lot of them. Old men, the infirm, a lot of people you don't want, the weak, they will die. Then, once these people settle in different parts of the empire, they will be separated from their other, from the others, from their group, from their ethnicity. And what happens is that within one generation, especially the children come to this new place, they will lose their identity. Whatever they were before, they are not anymore. Their country no longer exists. Their people no longer exist. So if they survive, they will become something else there. And that means that they will not be a threat to the Assyrians. At the same time, what they are doing is that they are emptying the land that they have conquered, and they are bringing in Assyrian colonists to settle. And of course, those Assyrian colonists are part of the Ilku system. That means that they are granted land, and in exchange for that land, they have to provide military service. In this map, what you see is actually what happened to the Israelites, the kingdom of Israel, which had become, a significant regional power around the year 700 BC. In the year 722, it was taken. The capital Samaria and the kingdom were conquered by the Assyrians, and the population of the kingdom of Israel was deported. There were at least 3 major deportations that we know of, and this is more or less where we think they were sent. And the result of this is that the Israelite people ceased to exist. The Israelites disappeared. Of course, some of them survived, but within 1 or 2 generations, they became something else because they had been pushed apart. So after 722, the kingdom of the small kingdom of Judah remains in the south, but the Israelites disappear from history. There's still one group, they call themselves Samaritans, and they claim, and it seems that they are in kind of a way descendants of the Israelites who were not deported, because the deportation was never 100% effective, of course. But it was extremely efficient when it came to getting rid of opposition. So here we see a map with the greatest extent of the Assyrian Empire. From that core territory that is in the dark green, they expanded throughout Mesopotamia into Elam, which is modern-day Iran. They expanded as far as north as Urartu, which the Urartians were related to the Hurrians, remember, from the kingdom of Mitanni. So they conquered the Urartians. They expanded into Asia Minor, into Anatolia in the west, and they conquered all of Syria, Palestine, and the big prize, Egypt. Egypt, which was incredibly wealthy and powerful, was conquered by the Assyrians. And here we see a depiction of King Ashurbanipal hunting a lion. He was responsible for the conquest of Egypt. And it is considered that under Ashurbanipal, the Assyrians attained the highest level of power. This panel right here is actually part of the what is called the lion hunt panels. And in his palace, there are many depictions of him hunting on foot, hunting on horse, hunting on the chariot. By the way, lions existed throughout the Middle East, and actually there were even lions in Greece at that time before they became extinct because of hunting. Ashurbanipal also made Nineveh one of the greatest capitals of the Middle East. Nineveh was a very old city. It existed before Ashurbanipal, but under Ashurbanipal, he rebuilt the whole wall, the fortifications. He filled it with palaces and temples. Here we see another view of what is left of Nineveh. Sadly, this doesn't convey the greatness of what this city used to be. But it was not only about appearances. Yes, the city was supposed to project the incredible power of the Assyrian king, the incredible power of Ashurbanipal, but also it was the nervous center of the empire because in Nineveh there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of bureaucrats. A bureaucrat is an administrator. Bureaucrats are people who know how to read and write. And they were producing a lot of records, they were producing a lot of correspondence to different governors throughout the empire. They kept the empire working. They knew how many people live in the empire. They knew how much revenue the empire was getting. They knew how many soldiers were necessary for the army. They were the bean counters. They were the people who were able, through their organization, to keep the logistics of the military machine working. When we think about Assyria as a military society, it is impossible to have a military that is so efficient without an efficient bureaucracy like the one that existed here. And yet, soon after the reign of Ashurbanipal, Assyria not only declined but collapsed. It fell rapidly. It is really amazing how fast this empire collapsed. And in this map, you see that there are many pressures. The first pressure was internal because very often there were rivalries within members of the royal family, and sometimes when a king came to the throne, he was challenged by a brother. So there is a certain element of civil conflict, but there are other pressures. You see right here that Babylon became independent in the year 627 BC under a dynasty known as the Chaldeans. Why was Babylon able to become independent? Because the Assyrians are under pressure from other places. Revolts in Egypt, nomadic raids from Anatolia, as you can see on the left, and actually from the north and east, you see another set of arrows that says nomadic raids. Those were the Scythians. The Scythians were an Indo-European nomadic people, great horsemen, who start to appear in great numbers, launching raids against Assyrian towns, putting a lot of pressure on them. And there's something else. The Assyrians had engaged in this cycle of empire. I conquer my neighbors so they don't represent a threat. Once I conquer them, I have new neighbors. So what do I have to do? Well, I have to conquer my new neighbors so I now can protect myself from the others. And once I conquer them, I have to conquer the one next and the one next and the one next. Once you become engaged in this cycle of empire, it never ends. You have to keep expanding. Until when? Until your resources do not match your military needs. There will be a point where the resources of the Assyrian military are not there. There are not enough men to garrison every single city that they have conquered. There are not enough men to launch these campaigns that are massive in terms of the number of men. And when cities revolt, what do? You go in and you repress them harshly and you destroy them and you kill them by the thousands. And people say, you know what? If we abide by what they say, if we don't abide by what they say, they kill us. And if we abide by what they say, they kill us too. And so Babylon takes a chance. They revolt and they win and they become independent. And of course, this is not good for the Assyrians because it sets the precedent that they can be defeated, that you can actually become independent from them. So finally, there will be a coalition that will bring about the end of the Assyrians. In the year 612 BC, an army of Chaldeans, who are the ruling dynasty of Babylon, Medes, who are an Indo-European people from what today is Iran, and the Scythians, nomadic horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia. They are going to come together and they are going to converge upon the city of Nineveh. They will lay siege to the city, they will break through the defenses, they will go in, and they will massacre the population. The city is going to burn to the ground. And this is the end of the Assyrian Empire. It is believed that for another 6 years, the monarchy, a new king, will still rule from the city of Haran in the north. But 6 years after that, uh, they are the Assyrians. That last group of Assyrians are defeated. And what happened to the Assyrian people? Well, their conquerors did to them the same thing that they had done to their enemies. That is, they were subjected to mass deportations. Some became slaves, others died on the long marches, and others settled in different lands where they lost their identity, and the Assyrian Empire disappears. But the Assyrians are not only great warriors. In a time of brutality, they acquire a reputation for being brutal, and that's in part because of the propaganda, but there is probably some significant amount of truth to that. They were primarily a warrior society, a society that conquered territory, but they were incredibly cultured. They are the heirs to the civilization of the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Amorites from Babylon and all of those great civilizations that had existed in that land for 4,000 years. And they knew it. Archaeologists found in one temple a dedication stone. These stones were usually placed in the foundation of a building. And this dedication stone, and I don't remember exactly the quote, but it says something like, I so and so, and he gives his title, he's an Assyrian government. I am rebuilding this temple in the same place where my fathers, the Sumerians, built the first one. And this is amazing, right? Because here you have a man, an Assyrian official, who is very conscious that he's doing something that has been done for the last 2,000 years, that he is at one end of a process that started with the Assyrians. They are very historically conscious. They know that history doesn't start with them, that history started with these Sumerians that were building the blocks of civilized life. And perhaps the greatest symbol of that is the Royal Library of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal built this library, and what you see on the left is an artistic image of what it could have been like. We don't know. The ruins were found in the 19th century, and along with the ruins, thousands and thousands of tablets containing one of the greatest cultural treasures of humanity. Now, remember that in those days, there were no books. Texts were written in clay tablets. When Nineveh was conquered and destroyed, the library, like every other building, was burned. And all of these buildings had wooden beams and columns. So when the wood burned, these things collapsed. And of course, there was a huge conflagration. Now, what happens to clay when you subject it to fire? Well, it hardens. And many of these tablets of clay became hard as a rock, and they were buried for thousands of years. And then they were discovered. And what the archaeologists discovered there was incredible. In this library, Assyrian scholars would collect all of the great works of Mesopotamia since the time of the Sumerians. Works written in Sumerian, in Akkadian, and other languages. But also, there were translations of these works, translations in different languages. And there were dictionaries, not so much dictionaries as, well, I guess it's a dictionary, lists of words and how this word was written in other languages, glossaries, if you wish. And this information is very important because through this, archaeologists and epigraphers are people who look at inscriptions, have been able to decipher virtually all of the languages that were spoken in ancient Mesopotamia and they were written at one time. So if there was a language was spoken and was written in ancient times, we know or there's someone in the world who knows how to read it, thanks to the work of these scholars. And here we can imagine the scholars, cataloging these tablets, writing tablets, discussing what they were writing or reproducing or copying. And they were very conscious. The Assyrians knew that it is not about conquest, but it's also about building up history and leaving a legacy behind. Unfortunately, their city was destroyed and their library was destroyed, but those texts luckily remain buried. And today, thanks to that, we have access to their history, to their culture, to the way they look at life. The copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, this great work of literature, the foundational work of literature of the human race, was found at the Library of Nineveh. And that is very important. In addition to that, the Assyrians were able to unify a huge area of the Middle East politically, economically, and culturally. At one point, the language of the Arameans, who were people who lived under them, became the common language of the whole area. Aramaic became the lingua franca, the language that everyone spoke. Actually, when Jesus was born, his language was not Hebrew, his language was Aramaic. And that is in part because of what the Assyrians did. They built roads, they connected this uh, ancient uh, world. And what this teaches you is that not everything in history is black and white, that there are subtleties, and that civilizations that can be extremely brutal can also be sublime and exquisitely cultured.